one of the things that stands out to me is that in those moments where he took the time to leave and have those moments of solitude, where he prioritized that prayer, and he prioritized that be still moment, and he prioritized that time with the Father, the needs never changed. There was still so much more healing that he could do. There were still people that needed to be taught. There were still people that needed to be reached out to. But Jesus recognized that in order to keep being able to do that, he needed to be still. And so over the next few slides, I'm going to have some snapshots just through all the gospel accounts where we can get a glimpse of the prayer life of Jesus. And one of the things that I have often done whenever I've focused on teaching on Jesus and prayer is I often focus on the how to pray part. Jesus teach us how to pray, and we'll break it down and we'll look at the prayers of Jesus and we'll say, this is what he showed us in the how to pray. But in this one, the lesson in it as we go through these, because it's overwhelming throughout the Gospels when we look at his prayer life, is not as much about the how. It's the when. Look at this as we go through. I'm doing this, I could have done one when it comes to the bullets, but there's too many because over the next few slides, so I'm just sticking it up there. If you want a copy of that list, let me know. Or, new generation and all that, take out your phone and take a picture, and then you've got that list, right? But when we look at the prayer life of Jesus, beginning in Luke chapter 3, right? At his baptism, in Luke 3, 21 through 22, in the Luke account, it specifically mentions that while Jesus was praying, he then had the opportunity, right? And so it comes into it. Mark chapter 1, 35 through 36, in the morning before he heads to Galilee, he spends that time in prayer. We just looked at that in Mark chapter 1. In Luke chapter 5, verse 16, after healing people. In Luke chapter 6, praying all night before choosing his 12 disciples. We talked in Luke chapter, when we looked at Luke chapter 5 earlier, about the importance and how pivotal that was, right? So pivotal that Jesus never went to sleep that night before he was up all night in prayer and fasting, because there was never a greater decision to be made than who were those 12 that he was picking to carry on the kingdom, that kingdom work after he left. So he's praying all night and fasting before choosing his 12. Matthew chapter 11, while speaking to the Jewish leaders, and it was the frustration of that, you see this prayer. Now, it always makes me chuckle because it makes me think of my mum whenever she would get frustrated at me, and it would be that, give me strength, right? Like, that's kind of what I get, right? Like, when I look at this. So in Matthew chapter 11, while he's speaking to the Jewish leaders, there's this time where he interacts with the Father, and then he brings it back to them. John chapter 6, giving thanks to the Father before feeding the 5,000. Matthew 14, before walking on water. Mark chapter 7, while healing a deaf and mute man. Matthew 15, giving thanks to the Father before feeding the 4,000. That's slide 1, right? Luke chapter 9, before Peter called Jesus the Christ. Luke 9 also at the Transfiguration. The next chapter, Luke 10, at the return of the 70, after he has sent them out. Right? In Luke chapter 11, we talk about the Lord's Prayer. But before teaching the disciples that this is how you pray, the model prayer, he prays. He prays to the Father. John chapter 11, before raising Lazarus from the dead. Matthew chapter 19, he's laying hands on and praying for the little children. John chapter 12, asking the Father to glorify his name. Matthew chapter 26, at the Lord's Supper. Luke chapter 22, he prays for Peter's faith, where he talks about how Satan had asked to sift him, right? And he prays for the faith of Peter, okay? John chapter 17, I could spend a whole series on John chapter 17 alone, but he prays for himself, he prays for his disciples, and he prays for all of those who come to belief through the disciples' teaching, which is all believers, essentially, when it comes back to it, which is pretty cool to think about the fact that Jesus, our Lord and Savior, has prayed for us. Right? Yeah. Matthew chapter 26 in Gethsemane before his betrayal. Russell referenced that last week in the communion thought. Not my will, but thine. Not my will, but thine. Not my will, but thine. And that prayer that we see in Matthew chapter 26. On the cross, Father, forgive them. Luke chapter 23. Matt referenced it this morning in communion, where he called out to the Father 3 times there when he was on the cross. And so there's this prayer, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Luke chapter 24, after the resurrection, praying a blessing on the bread. and then Luke chapter 24 also before his ascension. And so yes, we can go through and we could be like, what did Jesus teach in those prayer moments? But what I want to look at is in those 3 slides, that is a life that is saturated, absolutely saturated with those moments where it's a communication with the Father. Moments where it's be still. Moments where it's in the life of so many things going on, yet he still prioritized that communication. And when I look at that, I think, man, wow. Because I challenge myself, sitting back on the stool amongst all of us, am I there yet? I'm not. And so when we challenge ourselves and we think about the growth opportunity, let's model ourselves on Jesus while we look at that. In Mark here, in chapter 2, you see this teaching, and I want to bring this in while we look at this passage, and let's talk about it a little bit before I read the passage. So often, when we think about this aspect and we challenge ourselves and we think, man, I need to pray more, man, I need to read more, man, I need to meditate more, I need to incorporate fasting, I need to honor the Sabbath, I think about all the spiritual disciplines that I need to do. It then almost becomes like this burden on us, because it's like I'm just adding to this checklist, but I already feel like I'm too busy, and I already feel like I'm too stretched, and now I need to be doing more, right? And we have this checklist mentality of boom, 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 this is all the stuff I need to be more, and we start kicking ourselves. I'm not doing a good job, I need to do more. I love this passage in Mark chapter 2, because as he interacts with the Pharisees here, you see a glimpse into the checklist mentality, I guess is what I want to get at. So let's read the passage, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Mark chapter 2, starting in verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain, and the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" In verse 25, he answers, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? And in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God, and he ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions." Then in verse 27, he says to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." What an interesting interaction. What an interesting interaction. So as the Pharisees come to him and they're like, "Man, your disciples aren't following the commandments like they should, right? You're going through the grain fields and they're picking that heads of grain." And Jesus' response is an interesting one, because he takes them back to this account of David and his companions when they're hungry. And what do? They go into the house of God and they eat the consecrated bread. Is David a priest? No. Should he have been in there? No. And yet Jesus in this interaction points to it like he's saying, David did the right thing. Right? As he's interacting with the Pharisees, he's looking at them and he's saying, David did the right thing. And you know why? He took care of that need that needed to be met in that time, right? And he's challenging them. Spirit of the law versus letter of the law. Because when it comes to the Pharisees, what they'd done was they'd taken this command of keeping the Sabbath and keeping it holy, and they'd started adding all of this stuff. What does that mean? How far can we walk? What food prep can we do? You know, if an animal gets hurt, can we do this? Can we do that? And they start trying to parse out every single thing that you can and you cannot do, that checklist mentality, right? And what ends up happening for the Jewish people as they're trying to follow all of these different traditions is it becomes this burden. Like, oh no, the Sabbath is coming up, rather than, whoo, the Sabbath is coming up, right? And that's what happened as a result of it. And so Jesus is challenging them and he's reminding them it's not about that. Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And when I think about that, I can switch that out when it comes to our prayer time or any of our spiritual disciplines, because often in our head, we start adding it and making it kind of burdensome. Like, oh man, I have to incorporate this. The preacher, last Sunday Jim asked us to pray, and this Sunday Robin's telling us to pray, and now I'm going to have to look at my already busy schedule and figure out what I'm going to do, and then I start stressing myself out, and then I get even more guilty, right? And he reminds them, in this instance, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And so ultimately, it comes down to, what is it for? It's for us and our relationship with God and that chance to grow stronger. And so as we go through all of these things and we look at the life of Christ, the challenge this morning is to, yes, look at the frequency of it, and yes, recognize that even in the midst of the busyness of Jesus' life, he was able to incorporate that. In our own busyness and our own life, there are ways to challenge ourselves to try and incorporate it, but we also have to give ourselves grace in that moment as well, in the moments that we're struggling with it too. Do not let this become a burden. Instead, let this become a renewal and a revigoration when it comes to our spiritual life and our walk with the Savior. And if we can do that and be encouraged by that, I think we can continue to grow from strength to strength. In Matthew chapter 11, this is the interaction that I mentioned in that long list of times that we see Jesus praying, where he prayed when he was with the religious leaders. So in Matthew chapter 11, just beginning in the lead up to that, John the Baptist's disciples had come and asked him a question, right? And in the midst of that, the Pharisees and the teachers were watching to see what his response was. And you see this really kind of interesting kind of give and take interaction, and the stressful interaction, I would think about it, when you see the challenge that comes there in Matthew chapter 11. And so right after that, so in that kind of like 20 through 24, those verses, he basically has a woe part, where he's like, woe to you, if only you had listened, otherwise you'd be like Sodom and Gomorrah. And so he's kind of has this reflection of, guys, like, you're not getting it, and woe to you, you're missing the kingdom message completely, and negative consequences are going to happen as a result of that. Then in verse 25, as we have this recording of what Jesus is saying, he says, I praise you, Father. So it's now become a prayer in the midst of this context. I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you've hidden these things from the wise and learned, and you've revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this is what you were pleased to do. And he recognizes, man, the elite, the religious elite, aren't getting it. But I'm praising you because the children, the ones who aren't that religious elite, they're getting it, and they're seeing it, and they're getting this message. It still is becoming clear, okay? And then in verse 27, he then kind of addresses everybody around them. So in this conversation, he prays to God in verse 25 and 26, and then in verse 27, he then kind of brings it to those that are around. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father. No one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him, right? Then in verse 28, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, heavy laden, your translation may say, and I will give you what? Rest. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. And so this morning, there's a challenge for us to incorporate being still. There's a challenge for us to incorporate Sabbath. There's a challenge for us to incorporate communication times with the Father. And as Jesus said to them in Matthew chapter 7, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. I guess that challenge that's inherent in it is keep on coming. Keep on coming. How often are we going to him and taking that burden and having that chance for rest? Right. Continue those moments to be still. Continue coming. It's not just a one and done thing, right? Continue to come to him, and he will give you rest. For us this morning, though, there's maybe some who haven't even had the chance to come at all, to enter into a relationship with Jesus. And so there's always the invitation and the opportunity for us to do so. We'll sing an invitation song in a moment. There's Joe right there, made eye contact with him. And that song, I think, is Trust and Obey, right? And so for us to come to Jesus and get that rest, we have to trust. We have to obey. I think back to Mark chapter 16, where it's not a come command, but it's a go command that he tells his disciples. And he tells them to go and proclaim the gospel to all nations. All right? And in the midst of that, in doing that, he mentions to them that those who believe and are baptized will be saved. Right? That's a conjunction. Those who believe and are baptized will be saved. And so for us to come and receive that rest, there's that opportunity always for us to come to Jesus and to receive that rest. But there's a gospel message that we have to respond to in order to do that. When we do that, you're not going to have a rest-free life, right? Your schedule's not going to necessarily just automatically come cool. 2015 and 2016, I'd already come to Jesus, right? But I still had my moment where I was stretched, right? But we know that when we come and when we respond, we have hope and we have faith and we can handle anything with the knowledge that Jesus can provide us rest in that moment. There's the challenge for us to continue coming to him as well. And so if you have something in your life right now which is not giving you rest, is not giving you at peace, and you need prayers from us, from the body, we'll happily do that. There'll be an elder here at the front and an elder at the back if you want to respond. But the invitation is there to come to Jesus, and he will provide rest for our souls. Let's have the opportunity to come while we stand.